I took the job because of the money. $500 per night to monitor an abandoned psychiatric hospital from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The ad said night watchman, but I should have known better when no interview was required. Just a signature on a stack of liability waivers and a thin envelope containing a brass key, a flashlight, and a laminated card with 7 rules printed in neat typewriter font.
Follow these precisely,
said the woman who hired me, her face partially hidden beneath the wide brim of a black hat. She never gave her name.
The employment agency will deposit your first payment tomorrow morning. Complete all 7 nights and you'll receive a bonus.
I almost laughed when I first read the rules. They seemed like a joke, the kind of thing bored security managers create to keep minimum wage employees on their toes. 1. Remain inside the main building from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. every night. Lock all exterior doors upon arrival. 2. Do not enter room 217 under any circumstances. 3. If you hear children laughing, follow the sound, but do not speak to them. 4. Should any of the public telephones ring, answer before the 3rd ring but say nothing. Hang up after exactly 43 seconds. 5. If you see a nurse in a white uniform, avert your eyes and walk in the opposite direction. 6. Between 3 a.m. and 3:17 a.m., stay in the main reception area with the lights off. 7. Leave a glass of water on the 3rd floor nurses' station before midnight. It must be gone by morning. My first night began uneventfully. I walked the dim hallways, the flashlight beam cutting through decades of dust. Most of the furniture had been removed, but heavy items remained. Metal bed frames, bolted-down desks, and rows of filing cabinets. The walls were institutional green, peeling in sheets to reveal older layers of paint beneath. At 11:30 p.m., I remembered rule number 7 and filled a plastic cup with water from a bathroom sink that sputtered and groaned before producing a stream of rust-colored water that eventually ran clear. I placed it carefully on the nurse's station counter on the 3rd floor, feeling ridiculous. By 2 a.m., I had explored most of the building and settled into the reception area with a paperback novel and a thermos of coffee. The quiet was absolute. No traffic sounds, no wind, not even the creaking of the old building. Just silence pressing against my eardrums. The first phone rang at 2:17 a.m. I nearly jumped out of my skin. The sound was impossible. The building had no electricity except for the emergency lights, and the phone lines had surely been disconnected decades ago. Yet the shrill ring echoed down the corridor to my left. Following the sound, I found an old wall-mounted phone with a rotary dial, its black plastic housing covered in dust except for a pristine handset that gleamed as if recently polished. It rang again, and I grabbed it before the 3rd ring, remembering Rule 4.
Hello?
A child's voice said from the other end.
Are you the new doctor?
I remained silent, counting the seconds in my head.
I know you can hear me.
The voice continued, higher pitched now.
We've been waiting for someone to play with. The nurses are so mean. They don't let us have any fun.
My skin prickled as I heard giggling in the background, multiple children, their laughter echoing as if in a large, empty space. At exactly 43 seconds, I hung up, my hand trembling. That's when I heard it. Children are laughing down the hall. The laughter drifted from the east wing, soft at first, then growing louder. Following Rule 3, I moved toward it, my flashlight beam bouncing off the walls as I walked. The laughter had a strange quality, like a recording played at slightly the wrong speed. I turned a corner and froze. At the end of the corridor stood 5 children in old-fashioned hospital gowns, their backs to me. They were playing some kind of hand-clapping game, their movements jerky and unnatural. The oldest couldn't have been more than 12. "Hello?" I called out, forgetting the rule about not speaking to them. The laughter stopped instantly. The children remained motionless for 3 heartbeats, then slowly, in perfect unison, began to turn. I bolted. I ran back the way I came, my footsteps thundering in the empty hallway. I didn't look back until I reached the reception area, panting and sweating. Nothing had followed me. The corridors were empty and silent once more. I checked my watch, 2:47 a.m. According to Rule 6, I needed to be in the reception area with the lights off from 3 a.m. to 3:17 a.m. I switched off my flashlight and sat in darkness, trying to calm my racing heart. As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I noticed something unusual. A thin line of light showed beneath the door marked Hospital Administration. I was certain that door had been locked when I checked it earlier. Now it stood slightly ajar. I glanced at my watch again, 2:59 a.m. Whatever was happening, I needed to stay put for the next 17 minutes. Rules were rules. The second hand ticked to 3 a.m., and immediately the building came alive with sound. Footsteps echoed from every direction, dozens of them, walking with purpose. I heard the squeak of wheels, the rustle of fabric, and the murmur of professional voices. It sounded exactly like a busy hospital during daytime hours. I sat perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. The footsteps came closer, passing by the reception area. Through the darkness, I saw shapes moving in the hallway, shadowy outlines of people in medical uniforms, pushing gurneys and wheelchairs. None of them looked in my direction. Among them walked a woman in a crisp white nurse's uniform. Unlike the others, she moved with deliberate slowness, her head turning from side to side as if searching for something or someone. As she neared the reception area, her head began to pivot in my direction. I remembered Rule 5 and immediately looked down at the floor, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure she could hear it. The footsteps stopped directly in front of me. Through my lowered eyelashes, I could see the hem of a white dress and white shoes positioned just beyond the reception desk. They remained there, motionless, for what felt like an eternity. A cold draft swept through the room, carrying the scent of antiseptic and something underneath it. Something sour and rotten. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that my breath clouded in front of my face. The white shoes shifted, taking one step closer to me. I kept my eyes firmly fixed on the floor, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to look up, to run. A voice spoke directly above me, a woman's voice but distorted, as if speaking through water.
"New watchman.
She said, the words barely discernible.
You'll learn."
The clock on my watch changed to 3:17 a.m., and instantly all sounds ceased. The temperature returned to normal. When I finally dared to raise my head, I was alone in the reception area. I spent the remainder of my shift huddled in a corner, flashlight clutched in my white-knuckled hand, jumping at every creak and groan of the old building. At 5:45 a.m., I remembered the glass of water I'd left at the third-floor nurse's station. I hesitated, then decided I needed to check it before leaving. Rule 7 said it must be gone by morning. If it wasn't, would that mean I'd failed somehow? The third floor was quiet as I approached the nurse's station. The plastic cup was exactly where I'd left it, but the water was gone. In its place was a small piece of paper, folded in half. With trembling fingers, I opened it to find a message written in faded blue ink. You broke Rule 3. Don't do it again. I should have quit then. Any rational person would have walked away, $500 richer, but considerably wiser. Instead, I checked my bank account the next morning and saw the promised payment had been deposited. $500 for one night of terror. Terror that was already beginning to feel distant and dreamlike in the daylight. Was it really so bad? Maybe I had imagined the worst parts. Maybe it was an elaborate hazing ritual for new security guards. I called the employment agency to ask about previous watchmen at Maple Grove, but the receptionist claimed they had no record of the position. When I mentioned the woman in the black hat, There was a long pause before she said, "We don't have anyone matching that description working here." Later that day, I drove past the hospital and parked across the street, studying the building from a safe distance. In daylight, it looked decrepit but ordinary, just an abandoned building slowly surrendering to decay and time. As I sat there, an elderly man walking his dog stopped beside my car.
Interested in the old loony bin?
He asked, nodding toward Maple Grove. "Just curious," I replied. "I heard it's haunted." The man snorted.
That place doesn't need ghosts to be scary. You know what they did there, don't you? Experimental treatments back in the 50s and 60s before regulations. They called it progressive therapy, but it was butchery, especially in room 217.
My blood ran cold. What happened in room 217? His eyes narrowed.
You really don't know? That's where Dr. Kellerman conducted his sleep studies. Kept patients awake for days, sometimes weeks. Said he was researching the connection between insomnia and mental illness. Half his subjects died. The other half
He tapped his temple.
never came back, if you know what I mean.
That night, I returned to Maple Grove at 9:45 p.m., armed with a stronger flashlight and a small digital recorder. I wanted evidence of what was happening, proof that I wasn't losing my mind. I followed the same routine, locking the doors and filling a cup with water for the third-floor station. This time, I set up the recorder in the reception area before beginning my rounds. At exactly 11:17 p.m., every toilet in the building flushed simultaneously. The sound was startling, a cascading chorus of rushing water echoing through the empty hallways. I hadn't noticed any such occurrence the previous night, but it didn't violate any of the rules, so I continued my patrol. The second floor was colder than the rest of the building. My flashlight beam caught something unusual on the wall, a series of handprints, small like a child's, pressed into the peeling paint. They formed a line along the corridor, leading toward the east wing. I followed them, recording everything on my phone as I walked. "I'm on the second floor," I narrated quietly, following what appears to be children's handprints. They're spaced evenly, about 3 feet apart, and seem to be leading somewhere specific. The trail ended at a door marked hydrotherapy. I pushed it open to reveal a large tiled room containing 6 rusted metal tubs. The air smelt strongly of mold and chlorine. My flashlight beam revealed murky water filling one of the tubs. That was impossible. The water had been shut off for decades. As I approached the filled tub, the surface of the water began to ripple, though there was no breeze. The ripples formed concentric circles as if something was rising from below. I backed away, my heart pounding. The door slammed shut behind me. I whirled around and grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Then I heard it, children laughing, the sound coming from directly behind me, from the direction of the tub. Following Rule 3, I turned to face the sound, but remained silent this time. The room was empty. The tub that had contained water was now dry and rusted like the others. The door clicked and swung open on its own. Walking back to the reception area, I checked the time. 2:45 a.m. 15 minutes until I needed to turn off my light and sit in darkness. I rewound the digital recorder to listen to what I'd captured so far. The recording contained only static and, at irregular intervals, a woman's voice whispering words I couldn't quite make out. My narration was completely absent. At 3 a.m., I turned off my flashlight as required. The hospital came alive around me just as it had the night before. Footsteps, wheels squeaking, muffled voices. Again, I kept my eyes lowered as shapes moved through the darkness. This time, however, something different happened. A hand touched my shoulder, cold, dry, and impossibly light, like paper rather than flesh. I bit my tongue to keep from screaming. The hand remained on my shoulder, its grip neither tightening nor releasing. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape.
Room 217.
Whispered a voice directly into my ear. It was the nurse again, her words distorted as before.
He's waiting for you.
I shook my head slightly, remembering Rule 2. Do not enter room 217 under any circumstances. The hand squeezed my shoulder, fingers digging in with surprising strength.
He knows you're here. He always knows.
At exactly 3:17 a.m., the presence vanished along with all the other sounds and sensations. I sat trembling in the darkness for several minutes before daring to turn my flashlight back on. When I finally gathered the courage to stand, I noticed something on the floor beside my chair. A hospital identification badge, the plastic yellowed with age. The photo showed a stern-faced man with thick glasses and a receding hairline. The name read, Dr. Victor Kellerman, Head of Research. The rest of my shift passed without incident, though I avoided the second floor entirely. At 5:30 a.m., I went to check the water glass on the third floor nurse's station. It was empty again, but this time there was no note. Instead, I found a small brass key sitting beside the cup. It looked ancient, with an ornate head featuring the number 217. I left it untouched and completed my shift, swearing to myself that I wouldn't return for a third night. Yet by evening, curiosity had begun to override my fear. What was in room 217? Why was it forbidden? The old man's story about sleep experiments echoed in my mind. I spent the afternoon researching Maple Grove's history at the local library. Newspaper archives revealed that the hospital had closed suddenly in 1972 following a state investigation into patient deaths. Dr. Kellerman had been the center of the controversy, but he was never charged. He committed suicide the day before his scheduled testimony, hanging himself in room 217. The article included a grainy photo of the hospital staff. Standing behind Dr. Kellerman was a nurse I recognized immediately, the same stern face I'd glimpsed last night. The caption identified her as Head Nurse Margaret Willoughby, found deceased alongside Dr. Kellerman. My third night at Maple Grove began with a strange calm. The hospital seemed to be waiting for something. I performed my usual tasks, locking doors and leaving water on the third floor, then began methodically checking each room, deliberately avoiding the second floor. At midnight, all the lights in the building flickered on. This was impossible. The electricity had been disconnected decades ago, yet every fixture blazed to life, illuminating hallways that had been shrouded in darkness. The sudden brightness revealed details I hadn't noticed before. Scratch marks around door frames, messages carved into walls, and most disturbingly, dark stains on the floors that my flashlight hadn't picked up. The light stayed on for exactly 30 seconds before plunging the building back into darkness, leaving me night-blind and disoriented. When my vision adjusted, I realized I was standing at the foot of the staircase leading to the second floor. I hadn't walked there consciously. Something was drawing me upward. The children's laughter started again, coming from directly above me. Following Rule 3, I climbed the stairs, my flashlight beam bouncing ahead of me. The second-floor corridor stretched before me, and at the far end stood a door with the numbers 217 in tarnished brass. The laughter seemed to be coming from inside. I approached slowly, remembering Rule 2. Do not enter room 217 under any circumstances. I had no intention of going in, but I needed to understand why the rule existed. As I neared the door, the laughter stopped. The silence that replaced it was heavy and expectant. I placed my hand flat against the wood, feeling a faint vibration beneath my palm, like something large was breathing on the other side. A piece of paper slid out from under the door, coming to rest on top of my shoe. I picked it up and shone my flashlight on it. The rules are for your protection, not his. He cannot leave 217 unless invited. Do not speak to him. Do not acknowledge him. If you hear your name, cover your ears immediately. The note was signed with a simple M. As I read the last word, I heard a voice call my name from inside room 217, my full name, which I had never shared with anyone associated with this job. I clapped my hands over my ears, dropping both the note and my flashlight in the process. My flashlight hit the ground and rolled, the beam sweeping across the hallway before settling on the door to room 217, which was now cracked open an inch. Something pale and thin, a finger, impossibly long and jointed in too many places, curled around the edge of the door. It probed the air as if testing it, then retreated. The door remained ajar. I backed away, keeping my ears covered, moving entirely by instinct. I didn't stop until I reached the stairs, then turned and fled to the first floor. In the reception area, I huddled in a corner checking my watch. 1:17 a.m. Still almost 2 hours before the required darkness at 3 a.m. I needed to regain my composure. The phone in the corridor rang. Following Rule 4, I answered before the third ring but said nothing.
"You're wondering about the rules,"
said Dr. Kellerman's voice, smooth and clinical.
"Every night watchman does. Let me explain them to you. The hospital exists in two states simultaneously, what was and what is. During the day, it's merely an abandoned building. But at night, between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., the veil thins. We exist again. All of us. The patients, the staff, the experiments."
I remained silent, counting the seconds.
Room 217 was my masterpiece.
He continued.
I discovered that the human mind, when deprived of sleep for exactly 7 days, becomes permeable, receptive to influences from other planes of existence. My subjects became vessels, you see. Perfect vessels.
His voice changed, becoming deeper, resonating with something that made my teeth ache.
"But I miscalculated. On the 7th night of the experiment, something came through. Something that wore my face, used my voice, but wasn't me anymore."
Exactly 43 seconds had passed. I hung up. The rest of the night I spent in constant motion, walking the corridors of the first floor, careful to follow every other rule to the letter. No more phones rang. No children laughed. At 3 a.m., I sat in darkness as required, but the nurse didn't approach me. At 5:55 a.m., I climbed to the third floor to check the water glass. It was still full, untouched. Beside it lay another note. "He knows you're sent now. You have 4 more nights. On the 7th, he will try to make you take his place. The rules cannot protect you anymore. Only I can. Meet me in the basement mortuary at midnight tomorrow." This time, the note was signed, Margaret Willoughby, head nurse. I completed my shift and went home, but sleep eluded me. The rules, I realized, weren't random. They were a defense system, designed by someone who understood the hospital's supernatural patterns. As long as I followed them, I was relatively safe. But now something had changed. My 4th night began with tension so thick I could barely breathe. The hospital felt different. More solid somehow, as if it were becoming more real with each visit. I performed my usual tasks mechanically, listening for children's laughter and waiting for ringing phones. At 11:30 p.m., I heard footsteps on the floor above me, heavy and deliberate. They paced back and forth, directly over my head, following my movements exactly. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved, they moved. At midnight, I made my way to the basement mortuary. The stairs leading down were pitch black, absorbing my flashlight beam as if drinking it. Each step I took felt final, irrevocable. The mortuary was a large room with tiled walls and a concrete floor sloping toward a central drain. Metal examination tables stood in a row, their surfaces dull in the flashlight beam. And there, waiting beside the last table, stood Nurse Willoughby. She looked solid, real, not like a ghost or apparition, but like a living woman in an outdated uniform. Only her eyes betrayed her true nature, too dark, too deep, like windows into an endless night.
You broke the rules.
She said, her voice normal now, not distorted as before.
You listened to him call your name. Now he can track you, even beyond these walls.
What is he? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper.
Not what. Who?
She moved closer.
Dr. Kellerman discovered something ancient during his experiments. Something that had been waiting for centuries to find a way in. It possessed him, then killed him, and took his form. I tried to stop it, to contain it in room 217 with wards and bindings. It killed me for my efforts.
She reached out, her hand passing through my arm, leaving a trail of cold.
The rules keep it contained, but it's growing stronger. It feeds on fear and curiosity. Every night, watchman who's ever worked here has contributed to its power.
How do I stop it? Her eyes met mine.
You can't. But we can trap it more securely. Bind it so it can never escape room 217 again. We'll need 3 things. Your blood freely given, the key that found you, and a 7th night's vigil.
And if I just don't come back? Her smile was sad.
It knows your name. It has your scent. It doesn't need you to come to it anymore. It will come to you.
I left at 6 a.m. with a plan and a terrible understanding. The rules hadn't been designed to protect the watchmen from the hospital's haunting. They had been created to protect the outside world from what was trapped inside room 217. The choice was clear: complete the ritual with Nurse Willoughby, or spend the rest of my life, however short it might be, looking over my shoulder, waiting for something wearing Dr. Kellerman's face to find me. I returned for my 5th night, the brass key to room 217 heavy in my pocket, ready to face whatever came next. My 5th night at Maple Grove began with purpose rather than fear. I arrived early at 9:30 p.m., giving myself time to prepare. In my backpack, I carried the items Nurse Willoughby had implied we would need: a small pocket knife for the blood offering, the brass key to room 217 that had mysteriously appeared, and a journal to document everything. The hospital seemed to sense my resolve. As I walked through the main entrance, the air grew dense and resistant, like wading through invisible molasses. The door slammed shut behind me with such force that dust rained from the ceiling. I locked all exterior doors as required by Rule 1, then made my way to the 3rd floor to leave the customary glass of water. This time, I found a message already waiting at the nurse's station, words formed in the dust on the counter. Midnight. Bring the key. I completed my usual rounds, hyper-aware of every sound and shadow. The building remained unusually quiet, as if holding its breath. No children's laughter, no ringing phones, no toilets flushing in unison. The stillness was more unnerving than any supernatural manifestation. At 11:45 p.m., I descended to the basement mortuary. The stairs felt longer than before, the darkness thicker. My flashlight beam seemed to penetrate only a few feet ahead before being swallowed by the gloom. Nurse Willoughby was already there, standing in exactly the same position as the night before. This time, I noticed details I had missed. The small blood stain on her collar, the way her uniform seemed to shift between solid and transparent, and the faint blue tinge to her skin.
You came back.
She said, sounding almost surprised.
Most don't, after learning the truth.
You said he would find me anyway, I replied, setting my backpack down. I'd rather face this on my terms. She nodded.
The binding ritual must begin at midnight and conclude before 3 a.m. After that, the barriers between worlds grow too thin. He would be too powerful to contain.
Exactly what are we binding? She hesitated.
Names have power, especially true names. The entity residing in room 217 is ancient, predating this hospital, this country. Dr. Kellerman called it forth, though he thought he was merely experimenting with consciousness. He gave it access, and it took him first.
But what do you call it?
The Watcher in the dark. The one who waits behind the door.
She moved to one of the examination tables.
It consumes identities, memories, personalities, souls, if you believe in them. It wears its victims like suits, discarding them when they're no longer useful.
I shivered. And it wants me?
It wants everyone, eventually. But yes, you specifically now. Night watchmen are ideal vessels, already attuned to darkness, to liminality, to the in-between hours when reality grows thin.
She pointed to my backpack.
You brought the key?
I removed it from my pack, holding it up. In the beam of my flashlight, the brass gleamed as if freshly polished.
Good. Now, the ritual requires precise timing and movement through the hospital. First, we must mark 7 specific locations with your blood. Not much, just a drop at each site. These locations form a binding septogram around room 217.
And after that?
After that, you must confront what waits in 217. Not to defeat it, no one can, but to lock it in place while I complete the binding from the outside.
The implication was clear. I would need to enter the very room I had been explicitly forbidden to access. I would have to face whatever wore Dr. Kellerman's face. Will I swallowed hard. Will I come out again? Nurse Willoughby's expression softened slightly.
That depends entirely on you. The entity will attempt to confuse you, to trick you into taking its place. It will offer you knowledge, power, and relief from fear. It will show you wonders and horrors beyond imagination. You must resist.
She handed me a folded paper with a crude map of the hospital, 7 X marks indicating the blood offering locations.
We begin now. Midnight approaches.
The first location was in the basement boiler room, a massive space filled with rusted machinery. Nurse Willoughby directed me to a specific pipe junction.
Here,
She said, pointing.
1 drop.
I used the pocket knife to prick my finger, then pressed it against the cold metal. The blood seemed to sizzle on contact, spreading outward in thin tendrils before disappearing completely into the pipe. The building groaned around us, a deep structural sound I felt more than heard.
It knows.
Nurse Willoughby whispered.
Hurry.
We moved quickly through the hospital, marking each location with my blood. The second spot was behind a medicine cabinet in the first-floor pharmacy, and the third was at the base of the main staircase. With each blood offering, the building's reactions intensified, lights flickering in rooms that had no electricity, doors slamming in distant corridors, and a persistent whispering that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves.
It's fighting the binding.
Nurse Willoughby explained as we hurried to the 4th location, a spot beneath a window in the 2nd-floor day room.
The entity knows what we're attempting.
I pricked my finger again, the small pain barely registering through my adrenaline. As I pressed my blood to the peeling wallpaper, the window above shattered inward, showering us with glass. I ducked, throwing my arms over my head, but Nurse Willoughby remained perfectly still, the glass passing through her incorporeal form.
We must hurry,
She urged.
The 5th point is in the children's ward.
The children's ward was the most unsettling area of the hospital I'd encountered yet. Faded cartoon characters peeled from the walls, their cheerful expressions turned grotesque by time and water damage. Small beds with metal frames were arranged in neat rows, some still containing tattered mattresses and restraint straps. Why were children restrained? I asked, horrified.
Not all patients here were truly ill.
Nurse Willoughby replied, leading me to a closet door at the far end of the ward.
Dr. Kellerman believed that children were more susceptible to his experiments. Their minds were more permeable, he claimed.
The fifth blood mark went on the inside of the closet door. As my blood touched the wood, I heard children whispering from inside the empty closet. Their voices sounded desperate, pleading. "Help us. He's coming. He wears the doctor's face, but he's not the doctor."
Don't listen.
Nurse Willoughby warned, pulling me away.
They're not really children anymore. They're echoes, impressions left in the fabric of this place.
The sixth location was outside room 217 itself. The corridor leading to it was significantly colder than the rest of the building, frost forming on the walls despite the summer heat outside. The door to 217 vibrated slightly, as if something inside was pressing against it. I hesitated, the pocket knife poised above my already sore finger. "What exactly happened to Dr. Kellerman?" I asked. "The newspaper said he hanged himself, but you said something possessed him." Nurse Willoughby's face hardened.
On the 7th night of his final experiment, I found him in room 217 standing over his last test subject, a young woman named Eleanor. She was dead.
She paused.
Her eyes had been removed. Dr. Kellerman turned to me, but I knew immediately it wasn't him anymore. His movements were wrong, jerky, and too fluid simultaneously. He spoke, but his voice contained multiple tones, as if several people were speaking through him at once.
What did he say?
He said, "Margaret, I can see everything now. Come, look through my eyes." Then he tried to show me what was in his hands.
She looked away.
I ran. I gathered the other nurses, and we used old bindings. Folk magic some of the staff had brought from their homelands. We sealed him in room 217, but not before he had killed 3 more people.
I swallowed hard and pricked my finger, pressing the blood to the wall beside room 217's door. The effect was immediate and violent. The entire corridor shook, plaster raining down from the ceiling. A howl of fury emanated from behind the door, the sound impossibly loud and layered with dozens of voices screaming in unison.
The 7th mark must be placed on the roof, directly above room 217.
Nurse Willoughby shouted over the noise.
Then you must enter the room with the key while I complete the binding from outside.
We raced to the roof access stairwell, the building's violent shaking making it difficult to keep my balance. The door to the roof was jammed, swollen with decades of exposure to weather. I slammed my shoulder against it repeatedly until it finally burst open. The night sky above was wrong. Instead of stars, vast swirling patterns of darkness moved against a slightly lighter darkness. The air smelt of ozone and copper.
There.
Nurse Willoughby pointed to a spot near the center of the roof.
The final mark.
As I approached the spot, I noticed something peculiar. The roof directly above room 217 was marked with faded chalk symbols, complex geometric patterns surrounding what appeared to be ancient writing.
The original binding.
Nurse Willoughby explained.
Place your blood at the center.
I made the final cut deeper than the others, letting several drops fall onto the center of the chalk design. The blood didn't splatter or pool as expected. Instead, it was absorbed instantly into the roof, and the faded chalk symbols began to glow with a pale blue light.
It's time,
Nurse Willoughby said, her form beginning to flicker like a failing television signal.
Remember, no matter what it offers you, no matter what it shows you, you must lock the door and return the key to me. You have exactly 3 minutes inside that room. Any longer, and you risk being taken.
I clutched the brass key tightly, my palm slick with sweat and blood. What if I fail?
Then we all fail.
She replied simply.
And it escapes. Not just into the hospital, but into the world beyond.
We descended to the second floor in tense silence. With each step closer to room 217, the air grew thicker, harder to breathe. The walls seemed to pulse like living tissue. At 2:47 a.m., we stood before the door to room 217. The wood vibrated visibly now, the brass numbers rattling against their mountings.
3 minutes.
Nurse Willoughby reminded me.
Whatever happens, whatever you see, you must be out by 2:50. I'll be waiting.
I inserted the key with trembling hands and turned it. The lock clicked open with surprising ease, as if inviting me in. Taking a deep breath that did nothing to calm my racing heart, I pushed open the door to room 217 and stepped into darkness. The darkness inside room 217 was absolute, swallowing the beam of my flashlight completely. The door swung shut behind me with a soft click that somehow sounded final, definitive. I tried to steady my breathing, to focus on what I needed to do, but the air was thick and stale, tasting faintly of copper and something else, something ancient and wrong. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding muffled, as if the darkness itself was absorbing the sound. No response came, but I sensed movement in the room, something shifting position, readjusting itself. The darkness seemed to have weight and texture, pressing against my skin like wet velvet. Slowly, my eyes began to adjust, not to light, there was none, but to the different gradients of darkness. I could make out the basic shape of the room, a large square space with what appeared to be a hospital bed in the center. Leather restraints hung from its sides, their buckles glinting dully in the non-light. The walls were covered in writing, thousands upon thousands of words scratched into the plaster, overlapping each other in a maddening palimpsest. I moved closer, squinting to make out what they said. Sleep is a door. Dreams are windows. 7 days awake opens both. The words were repeated over and over, written in different hands, some neat and precise, others jagged and desperate, as if carved with fingernails. A soft voice spoke directly behind me.
Do you understand now why they come? Why did you come?
I spun around, heart hammering. A man stood beside the bed, tall and thin, with thick glasses and a receding hairline. Dr. Kellerman. He looked solid, real, his white coat pristine. Only his eyes betrayed his true nature. They were completely black, like holes cut into reality.
The night watchman.
He continued, his voice pleasant, academic.
You're all the same. Driven by curiosity, by the need to understand. That's what I sought too, before I became more.
I glanced at my watch. 2:48 a.m. 2 minutes left. You're not Kellerman, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You're what took him. The thing wearing Kellerman's face smiled.
Semantics. I am what he became. I am what you could become.
He gestured around the room.
Do you know what this room was designed for? Sleep studies. Kellerman believed that consciousness was a thin membrane separating humans from other states of being. He wasn't wrong.
The figure moved closer, its movements too smooth, as if it were gliding rather than walking.
7 days without sleep. That was all it took to wear the membrane thin enough for me to slip through. Kellerman was first, then the patients, then the staff who tried to stop me.
Nurse Willoughby trapped you here, I said, taking a step backward. The thing's smile widened impossibly, stretching beyond the confines of a human face.
Margaret. She was clever. Used old magic. Binding spells her grandmother taught her. But bindings weaken. Rules get broken.
It pointed at me.
You broke them.
I came to fix that, I replied, my hand moving to my pocket where I'd placed the key after unlocking the door. The darkness in the room shifted, coalescing around the Kellerman figure like a cloak.
I can offer you so much more than that pitiful nurse.
Knowledge, power, freedom from fear.
No thanks, I said, but my voice wavered. The figure's form blurred, reshaping itself. Suddenly, my mother stood before me, exactly as she had looked the day before she died from cancer 5 years ago.
Sweetheart,
She said in her voice, perfect and impossible.
I've missed you so much.
My heart constricted painfully. You're not her, I whispered.
I have her memories.
The thing said, still using my mother's voice.
I have her love for you. Isn't that enough?
It reached out to touch my face. I jerked away, checking my watch. 2:49 a.m. 1 minute left. The thing sighed with my mother's voice, then shifted again, returning to Kellerman's form.
You humans are so attached to authenticity. Very well. Let me show you what I really am.
The darkness behind Dr. Kellerman split open like a curtain, revealing a vista that my mind struggled to comprehend. I saw vast, impossible geometries, structures that seemed to fold in on themselves in ways that shouldn't be possible in three-dimensional space. Massive shapes moved in that impossible landscape, things with too many limbs and eyes, communicating in patterns of light and shadow.
This is what exists beyond the membrane of sleep,
The thing explained.
This is what Dr. Kellerman glimpsed in his experiments. This is what awaits everyone, eventually.
It extended a hand that was no longer entirely human, elongated fingers tapering to points.
But you could see it now, understand it now. All you need to do is give me the key, take my place here, and I'll show you wonders beyond human comprehension.
My watch beeped. 2:50 a.m. Time up. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the key. The thing's expression shifted to triumph, then confusion as I lunged for the door, shoving the key into the lock from the inside.
No!
It roared, its voice fracturing into dozens of different tones. It surged toward me, Kellerman's form melting away to reveal something composed of writhing darkness and too many limbs. I turned the key, feeling the lock engage with a solid click. The thing slammed into an invisible barrier inches from my face, howling in frustration. I could see it clearly now, a shifting mass of darkness punctuated by dozens of eyes, all with familiar irises, all belonging to people it had taken.
You can't leave,
It shrieked.
The door is locked.
From the inside, I confirmed, backing away. That's what Nurse Willoughby meant. The binding isn't to keep you in room 217. It's to keep you from leaving the hospital entirely. I turned and ran, the thing's screams following me down the hall. The building shook violently, plaster cracking from walls and ceiling. I raced down the stairs, nearly falling in my haste to reach the first floor. Nurse Willoughby waited for me in the reception area, her form more solid than I'd ever seen it. A soft blue light emanated from her, pulsing in time with the building's shuddering.
You did it.
She said, relief evident in her voice.
You locked it in.
What happens now? I gasped, struggling to catch my breath.
Now we complete the binding.
She replied, holding out her hand.
The key.
I reached into my pocket, but my fingers closed on empty space. The key was gone. Nurse Willoughby's expression changed to horror.
You left it in the lock.
I had to, I explained. It was the only way to... A tremendous crash cut me off as the ceiling above us partially collapsed. Through the gaping hole, I could see straight up to the third floor, and beyond it, to the rooftop, where the chalk symbols were now blazing with blue fire.
The binding is failing.
Nurse Willoughby said, her voice rising in panic.
Without the key, I can't complete the ritual.
The building's shaking intensified. Doors throughout the hospital began slamming open and closed in rapid succession. Children's laughter echoed from every direction, overlaid with screams and the clinical monotone of Dr. Kellerman's voice reciting observations. There must be another way, I pleaded. Nurse Willoughby's eyes met mine, resignation settling over her features.
There is, but the cost is high.
Above us, a terrible rending sound echoed through the building as something began tearing its way through the floors, heading downward. Whatever it costs, I said, I'll pay it.
A willing sacrifice.
Nurse Willoughby said, her voice barely audible over the hospital's violent destruction.
The original binding was created with my death. I chose to remain, to guard this place, to enforce the rules, but my power wanes with each passing year.
She held out her translucent hand.
Take it. Complete the circle.
I hesitated, then reached out. As our hands met, hers solidified, becoming warm and real. A jolt of electricity shot through me, and suddenly I could see, not just the physical hospital, but layers of reality stacked upon it like transparencies. I saw the history of Maple Grove playing out simultaneously, patients strapped to beds, doctors administering treatments, children huddled in corners, and throughout it all, the dark entity spreading like an infection from room 217.
The binding requires a guardian.
Nurse Willoughby explained, her voice now inside my head.
Someone who understands the rules, who knows what's at stake.
Another crash thundered through the building as something massive broke through to the second floor. I could feel it coming, a roiling darkness punctuated by stolen eyes and borrowed limbs fueled by rage and ancient hunger. I'll be trapped here? I asked, already knowing the answer.
Not trapped, bound. There's a difference.
Her form began to fade, blue light transferring from her to me.
You'll walk between worlds, between what was and what is. You'll make rules for the next watchman and the next. You'll protect the world from what waits in room 217.
The entity smashed through to the first floor, manifesting as a writhing mass of darkness and fragmented human parts. Dr. Kellerman's face appeared and disappeared within it, along with dozens of others, patients, staff, and previous night watchmen. It surged toward us, a tidal wave of stolen lives. How do I stop it? I shouted, panicked.
You already know the rules.
Nurse Willoughby replied, her voice fading as her form became transparent.
Now enforce them.
Understanding flooded through me. I turned to face the approaching horror, raising my hands that now glowed with the same blue light that had emanated from Nurse Willoughby. Words came to me, not English, not any language I recognized, yet I understood their meaning perfectly. I spoke the words with authority, feeling power rush through me. The entity recoiled, shrieking in multiple voices. The blue light spread from my hands, forming complex patterns in the air. The same symbols I had seen on the roof. The same binding that had held for decades. You belong in room 217, I commanded, my voice resonating with power that wasn't entirely my own. You will not leave Maple Grove. The entity thrashed against the binding, fragmenting and reforming.
Who are you to command me?
It howled.
You're nothing. A temporary vessel, a flicker of consciousness.
I am the guardian of Maple Grove, I replied, the words feeling right, true. I make the rules here. The blue symbols encircled the entity, contracting like a net. It fought, tearing at the binding, but for every strand it broke, I created two more. Gradually, inexorably, the light forced the darkness back, compressing it, driving it up through the floors toward room 217. The process was excruciatingly slow. Dawn approached. I could see gray light filtering through the shattered windows. As the sun rose, the entity's power would wane, but the binding needed to be complete before then. With one final surge of effort, I pushed the entity completely back into room 217. The door slammed shut, and the blue light sealed every crack and crevice. From inside, muffled howls of rage continued, but they were contained. controlled. Exhausted, I collapsed to my knees. The hospital around me had changed, no longer decaying, but not restored either. It existed in a state of suspension, caught between what was and what is, just as Nurse Willoughby had described. As the sun's first rays touched the building, I felt myself changing too. Not dying, but transforming, becoming something between living and dead, solid and incorporeal. The rules of Maple Grove inscribed themselves in my mind, expanding beyond the 7 I had been given. I understood now why children's laughter must be followed, but never engaged. Why phones must be answered for exactly 43 seconds. Why water must be left at the nurse's station. Each rule was a strand in the binding web, each ritual a reinforcement of the barriers keeping the entity contained. And I was now part of that web, the new guardian, the new author of rules. Morning fully arrived, and with it, a strange peace settled over Maple Grove. The entity in room 217 retreated to whatever dark dimension it occupied during daylight hours. The hospital stood silent, waiting for night to fall again. I walked to the main entrance, looking out at the overgrown grounds. I could leave now, I realized. Walk away in the daylight. But sunset would come, and with it, the thinning of the veil. Someone needed to be here, to maintain the rules, to protect the unwary from what waited in room 217. A car pulled up outside the gate. The next night watchman, no doubt. The employment agency would keep sending them, one after another, drawn by the promise of easy money. $500 per night to monitor an abandoned psychiatric hospital. I smiled sadly, already composing the rules I would write for them. 7 rules, precise and cryptic. Enough to keep them alive if followed exactly. Enough to maintain the binding for another night. After all, rules exist for a reason, and some doors should never be opened